My first name just right.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, Thierry. Okay, I don't know if I can do the French R, but
If you say it fast enough, then
yeah, there you go. I'll just say it fast, and then hopefully no one will know if I'm saying it right or wrong. Okay, wonderful. Well, again, thanks everyone for coming to our webinar. This webinar is Enemies on the Owyhee River as a Site of Encounter During the Snake War from 1864 to 1868. So we're super excited to have Dr. Thierry Veyrié here. I don't know if I said that right.
Veyrié, yep.
Veyrié. Okay. So he is a research associate at the American Indian Studies Research Institute at Indiana University of Bloomington, and is also the director of two language revitalization projects for the Fort McDermitt Paiute-Shoshone Tribe. Sorry, I'm trying to manage introducing as well as admitting people. He started conducting fieldwork in the Northern Paiute communities in 2012 while earning his master's degree in sociocultural anthropology at the could you say that for me, Thierry?
École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales.
So beautiful. And that's in Paris. So from 2014 to 2021, he was a graduate research fellow and instructor at Indiana University, where he also intermittently conducted field research in the oral traditions of the Fort McDermitt Paiute-Shoshone community. And he recorded new Paiute testimonies and translated existing records with elders in the community. Really, really exciting work. And then he spent 13 months in McDermitt, Nevada, for doing his doctoral studies. And which, as I understand, he's going to be talking to us about today. So he's got loads of really great credentials and has done a lot of really amazing work. So Thierry, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you to start chatting with us.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen, and thanks to the friends of the Owyhee, to Tim and Sammy and all the team for having thought of me as a presenter for this seminar. I mean, it's always special to talk about what you're passionate about. And so with this crowd, it seems that we share a lot of common interests. So I'm glad to be here and so humbled that you thought of me as a presenter for your series. Today I will talk about the Owyhee River as a site of encounter during the Snake War. And I only have one visual, a declination of one visual, that is a map from Gregory Micheneau's The Snake War, the deadliest war in the West, the Snake Conflict of 1864-1868. And I'll put it on right now. Oh, I need to first open it. Okay. And then my presentation I will be reading my presentation, so bear with me. And I will use those maps as a visual aid as I do. Okay. So here's the Owyhee River and Canyon as from the Snake River, the Deadliest Indian War of the West by Gregory Micheneau, which is a theater of the activities that I will narrate today. During the 4 years of conflict of the Snake War, the Owyhee River and Canyon were a site of engagement between Euro-American and Native groups. Euro-Americans consisted either of civilians, often assembled as a punitive militia, or regular military troops belonging to the Oregon Volunteers, were gradually replaced by the U.S. Army, starting in 1866. They were commanded by Major Louis H. Marshall in 1866 and by Colonel George Cook after. The Native American groups were Northern Paiute and Shoshone speakers who were commonly referred to as Snake Indians by whites of the time. In colonial sources, natives are often referred to as Indians, and I will use this term when I have no other ethnic indication in the data that I have available. Several Paiute leaders led bands that operated during the war in the Owyhee Canyon, including Egan, Ochiho, Winnemucca, and Bigfoot. While some Shoshones may have participated, the leadership and the bulk of the native fighters were Paiutes from the Snake River, from eastern Oregon, and from northern Nevada. In this presentation, I will offer an overview of the interactions between Native Americans and newcomers in the Owyhee River and Canyon during the Snake War. The Owyhee River serves as a place where Paiutes took refuge, engaged in battle with whites, communicated with their own language across the divide, and more symbolically, where the flow of the river took altogether the memory of lives, battles, and trauma. Please be advised that the descriptions of the battles and massacres can be shocking. The Snake War is dated by historians such as Merle Wells and Gregory Michneau to have started in 1864, but this date corresponds to the beginning of the first large military campaign led by the Oregon Volunteers to suppress trouble that had been building in the region for several years already. After the Pyramid Lake of 1860, some Paiutes took refuge in the north, in country that could better defend, and where they could also more easily hide. The discovery of gold in the Boise Basin in 1862 and of gold and silver in the Owyhees in 1863, with the founding of Jordan Valley, and then of Silver City in 1864, brought increasing number of prospectors and settlers through Paiute territory. The building of Fort Boise in 1863 was another sign that white newcomers were claiming native Aboriginal territory. The resistance of the Paiutes took the form of the capture of horses and stock, attacks on stagecoaches and travelers, and the arson of white settlements. Pete Snap, an oral historian from McDermitt, born just after the end of the Snake War, also relayed that the war lasted for 4 years. According to him, Numara, Paiute leader of the Pyramid Lake area, had tried 4 times to tell his people to stop stealing white belongings, but they would not listen to him. The result was that the white people made war on the Paiutes for 4 years. I will go over the conflicts in the Owyhee River year by year, with more attention to 1866 and 1867, which were the most intense years of the conflict in the area. And so now this map will slightly change. I will just highlight the events that happened in 1864, and I will narrate them here. So let us begin with the year 1864. The first year of the war was marked by the inefficiency of the Oregon Volunteers to establish a balance of power with native groups. General Alvord naively sent young Lieutenant Waymire to the field with 25 men in the spring of 1864. Waymire went after Paiutes who had stolen horses and mules, after a long journey, found several hundred Paiutes who had stolen several hundred Paiutes led by Ochiho, Egan, and Natchez, fortified on the South Steens Mountains. After several maneuvers and exchanges of fire, the Paiutes being equipped with rifles, Waymire retreated, realizing he was vastly outnumbered as more Paiutes kept arriving. The first significant battle on the Owyhee River took place that summer. After Captain Curry and then Captain William V. Reinhardt of the 1st Oregon Volunteers established Camp Henderson on Crooked Creek, a group of 84 Chinese miners were slaughtered on their way to Idaho City, allegedly by followers of Egan. In July, Indians stole stock near Silver City, and one of the settlers who lost cattle, Michael Jordan, went after the Indians with 20 other civilians. The party was routed by the Indians on the Middle Fork Owyhee, killing Michael Jordan, the prospector who had given his name to the creek that goes through the present town of Jordan Valley. Without waiting for the military, 134 civilians marched again after Indians on the Middle Fork Owyhee. They attacked an Indian group fortified in the canyon, killing 35 people, of whom most were women and children. The next year, on the Oregon-Idaho border, Camp Lyon would be established near present-day Cheville in late June. It would serve as a field base of operation for the remainder of the Snake campaign. In this first year, The Oregon volunteers led several expeditions but were unable to find any sizable native group in the area. The Paiutes were more likely to attack civilian militia than they were to attack soldiers wearing uniforms, which, as we'll see, is a pattern in the relationship between the Paiutes and newcomers. Now, let us turn to 1865. In February 1865, Indians raided along Jordan Creek and drove out settlers. They killed stagecoach agent John McCummins, drove off the company's stock and 500 sheep, and burned several houses. Miners from Ruby City went in the pursuit of the Indians, but did not find them at first. Only McCummins' hat and a portion of his boot were found. His body was thought to have been thrown in the Owyhee River. The second expedition of the Ruby City Rangers did find an Indian camp on February 15 and fought for an hour between the natives took off after many casualties. Camp Lyon proved to be a center of a region ripe with stock theft. In July, the Oregon volunteers chased Indians 45 miles all the way to Three Forks, where they found the stolen stock and 15 Indians. When the cavalry attacked, the Indians scattered across the river, leaving 4 dead behind. The soldiers burned their camp where they found dried meat and berries, bow and arrows, and blankets. They also found 2 revolvers and part of a Henry rifle. South, 1865 was the most intense year of the Snake War in the Queen River Valley, so south of where we see Camp McDermitt on this map. Right above it is the Nevada-Oregon border, and so that's where in 1865 it was like the main year of the Snake War in Nevada. And that's when Colin McDermitt was killed in the summer of 1865. The Nevada volunteers pursued several Paiutes and Shoshone band leaders, including the Paiute Black Rock Tom and the Shoshone Tzilowik. And so in August, Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDermitt was killed in an ambush, prompting the creation of Camp McDermitt, which we see on the map. Which brings us to 1866. In February 1866, 30 Indians attacked a ranch in Jordan Valley. The rancher, Andrew Hall, successfully kept the Indians at bay while he was wounded, and they only could burn part of his house. The Indians left before dawn with 37 cattle and 9 horses, and Hall asked for help in Camp Lyon. The military tracked 10 Indians going toward the Owyhee River. Several fought a brutal fight in the willows and brush by the river, and others returned to fire on the troopers' camp that evening. An attack on a Paiute winter camp in the Queen River, so south of this map, set off more native unrest in May 1866. The Beachy and Johnson stage station at Cane Spring, where the Paiutes found additional Henry rifles, was wrecked, followed by the station at Buffalo Spring, south of present-day Orovada, the next day. The war party went to the Owyhee crossing, where they sacked a ferry boat and probably joined other Paiute groups. In southern Oregon and Idaho, 3 Chinese parties en route to the Owyhee mines were massacred between May 19 and May 21st. Egan and Winnemucca were mentioned by the newspapers, but it is difficult to say if they were indeed responsible for these attacks. At the end of May, Major Marshall and 84 men from Fort Boise went after the Indians and fought 500 of them installed on a promontory between the south and middle forks of the Owyhee River. During a 4-hour engagement across the shores of the rivers, on the rough terrain of the Three Forks of Owyhee, the detachment fired over the canyon, including 5 cannon shells, some of which landed on Wickiups, and the Paiutes fired back. 12 years later, Sarah Winnemucca was camped with Lee Winnemucca in this very canyon, and he told the event as a comical story, quote, "A few years ago, we were on that hill yonder. The soldiers were on that steep mountainside. We then called out to them. They stopped, and they were so frightened that they shot at us across, and one and all of us called out to them again." Here my brother laughs so that Here my brother laughed so that I thought he would never stop. At last he said, "Dear sister, they had a cannon on a mule, and they shot at us before they took it off the mule's back, and the poor mule fell down the steep mountain." End quote. Limuinamokai arranged the unfolding of events to serve a comical purpose, but the gist of the campaign gave ample matter for mockery. Marshall decided to cross the Owyhee River 8 miles downstream to flank the Paiutes, but was rushed by daylight running out. Half of his command had crossed when his raft sank in the river under the weight of the howitzer. The Paiute did not attack, however, and at dawn, the rest of the men and supplies were carried across the Owyhee on a makeshift raft. Marshall sent scouts out to reconnoiter terrain and find Paiute positions, but this triggered a Paiute volley of fire, and a corporal was shot. In a very delicate situation and stuck under enemy fire on the shore of the river for an entire day, Marshall decided to retreat under the cover of the following night, leaving a few men to the Paiutes and the howitzer to the river. Pete Snap, the same Paiute historian from McDermitt, offers a slight different view on this event, one that expresses native agency and effective resistance. The discursive discrepancy between the military and the native accounts shows that suppression is not only physical coercion, but also a narrative denial of significance of the other. From the native perspective, resistance is not only expressed through visible actions, but also as a narrative presentation of yourself. So I will read this story in Paiute and then translate as I do. This text that was included in my dissertation was called "The Indians Rolled the Howitzer into the Owyhee River." Ya nona ibiga de wow. From here, meaning this valley, and back this way on the Owyhee, ka dupidia ramunaniad, they call it Rock Canyon. Ibi wapokwa manadikwe, a canyon on this side of Juniper Mountain. Mabi unaoga de wow, umeno na akwiwane munumi. From back there, the Indians had a war with them. Umeno na akwina, umen matu te a koina. They had a war with them and killed some of them. Yeji menome o you. Then the Indians there. The soldier's cannon, as it's called. It's called a howitzer. Okao ka unatuma na matishu kwanashi ka uwiu pahu kwete udotokwanai meneme. That one was pushed off into the river by the Indians after they left. Ka unagaupagaku. Oituka bahu kwetu udogono noihu. As it has wheels, they rolled it off into that river. Ushapa ushu ubio sapoka. So pauka. That's it. It's sunk in there. Uhu oho ka dewao matu dewao napitik. That's about what happened there. End quote. In June, the Paiutes continued raiding stagecoach stations north of Camp McDermitt, and civilians of the Owyhee district, and anxious to conduct the punishment that the army was unable to deliver, assembled in a party of volunteers led by Civil War veteran Isaac Jennings. In early July, several hundred Paiutes were camped and digging wild potatoes at Surwayua, willows in a row, in a canyon near the junction of the South Fork of the Owyhee River. When the 36 volunteers stormed in firing, Paiute warriors fought them until nightfall while the others moved toward the rimrock. At nighttime, the Paiutes held council and decided to move and bait the volunteers to an advantageous position. Jennings followed and got the volunteers trapped in a canyon for 5 days, sending messengers out for help when they had to start rationing their water and ammunition. Soldiers and volunteers made their way to the site, but the Paiutes left before reinforcement arrived, leaving behind horses and supplies that had been previously stolen. Jennings' party followed west, the trails of the 500 Indians that he considered to be led by Winnemucca, and checked in at Camp McDermitt on July 14. Captain John P. Baker added 25 men under Lieutenant Moulton to Jennings' party of 100 men, and they continued the chase. On July 27, Baker reported that Moulton was back and that when they overtook Winnemucca's, quote, hostile Indians, end quote, they scattered in all directions. These events, while providing evidence of native material depredation, also invite questions about the nature of the native hostility used by settlers to justify the killing of Indians. It is quite believable that Winnemucca was the leader of this Paiute group that timidly fought aggressive volunteers and refused confrontation when soldiers joined them, preferring mob fight. Two years later, 6 members of Bruno Shoshones reported that they had been forced in the summer of 1866 to join Winnemucca. Winnemucca seemed to walk the fine line of never fighting the U.S. Army in direct confrontation and seeking to unite under his influence various native groups by diplomacy or by force, which required for him to embody resistance and establish balance of power. Major Marshall was largely discredited. The troops' morale was low and the discipline loose when Lieutenant Colonel George Crook took over the command of the regulars in the Oregon-Idaho region. In his autobiography, Crook further commented about latent corruption. Quote, "It seemed that desperados had worked their men in all kinds of capacities and positions throughout this country, so as to allay suspicions and get information. Then, too, there were many bad men from the South congregated in that country, refugees, deserters, etc., all against the government. We see here that the government, through its military arm, is endowed with a civilizing and moralistic mission, but its legitimate violence is applied against the Indians." Crook adopted a strategy advised by Warm Springs Indian scout Donald McKay, consisting in staying in the field at all times and systematically attacking Paiute winter villages, forcing groups to hide away from rivers and areas in which large winter camps could be sustained. Shortly after his arrival at Fort Boise, Crook headed to the Owyhee River in a bad winter weather. On December 26, he found an Indian camp 20 miles west of Camp Lyon. The Paiutes and their Bigfoot stood the fight, but after several hours, retreated, having lost 25 warriors and Bigfoot's wife. This was the first major defeat suffered by Bigfoot. So I will turn now to the year 1867. Unlike his predecessor, Crook decided to go on campaigning through the winter, through blizzard and snow. On January 8, 1867, one of his lieutenants attacked a small Indian camp on the frozen Owyhee River, killing several while others escaped across the icy river. 3 weeks later, Crook found a village under Tonatocopa, the northeastern Steens Mountain, on January 29, 1867. Upon charging it, his horse bolted, and Crook jumped off it in the middle of the camp. Several accounts of the heroic and desperate fight by Paiute warriors without firearms were made by George Crook and Captain Louis Crook. Louis was an orphan Paiute boy captured that day. He later served Crook as an aide and a scout, took his name, and became a headman of the Wayadeaga. Crook wrote the following in his autobiography, quote, "At once I jumped off my horse and let him go. Running back, I found some of the Indians coming toward me. Particularly one fellow stopped, surrounded by soldiers, singing his death song and letting slip his arrows at his enemies. He must have been shot through and through half a dozen times before he fell," end quote. Captain Louis told his autobiography to Dr. Marsden, a physician in Burns, Oregon, who took up the Northern Paiute language as a hobby and worked on linguistic documentation project with a local Paiute community between 1891 and 1913. Captain Louis was 8 years old at the time of these events. Quote, I'm quoting Captain Louis now. "Then the white man came, and there was much fighting, and many of our people were killed. At that time, I was staying at the Rock Fort, Barren Valley, where there were 8 houses. No taikumi, Smeller, he picks up the tail, Greystone, Patacomaco, and Tunatocopa all had houses there. I was captured there at the rock fort. General Crook was the leader of the Black Clothes soldiers. All the people there were killed. I saw many of them myself. At that time, the snow was knee-deep. The big blind one, Pitutsujitu, escaped from there, though. 50 women, children, and babies were killed. Tunatacopa was our leader, and he had a spear with which he repeatedly stabbed the soldiers in the heart, causing them to die very quickly. I was standing close by him, and I saw him striking them with his long spear fastened on a pole. He killed many soldiers with his repeated stabbing. Then the soldiers grabbed hold of his spear and broke it, and they caught hold of him and were wrestling with him. They all caught hold of him and threw him down. They hit him on the head with a hatchet, but did not cut into his skull, and he did not die. Then they tied him with a rope. Then they cut out a mule from those wild ones and whipped it. Then the mule went along kicking at both feet. It kicked him with one foot in the chest. They caught hold of the mule and looked at the man. The captain said that he wasn't dead, so they cut out another mule and whipped it. Again, it went around kicking. Then they caught it and looked and saw that the man was dead. Then the two captains repeatedly stabbed his body with swords. The woman said that one of the swords was broken and wouldn't stick to his body. End quote. For the whole year 1867 and through the winter 1868, Colonel Crook obstinately tracked down and killed or captured all Paiutes he could find in southern Oregon. In the summer 1867, several Indian camps were attacked in the Owyhee Canyon. On August 11 and 15th, Captain Coppinger from Camp Three Forks charged a band of Paiutes and pursued them for 6 miles all the way to the river. A few days later, his Indian scouts found a camp 12 miles from the forks. He surrounded it under the cover of night and charged it at 2 a.m. More than 15 Indians were killed, and the camp revealed at daybreak to be a fishing camp. In October 1867, the pregnant wife of Sergeant Donoil was taken with her husband by ambulance from Camp Leon to Fort Boise. They were attacked by six Paiute warriors. Donoil was killed, and another sergeant was able to make an escape, reporting the supposed kidnapping of the pregnant Mrs. Donoil. Later, a Paiute confessed having killed her there at the time of the attack, but the word was out that she may still be alive. Several companies were dispatched to rescue the white woman, and on October 26, 1867, the Paiute camp was found and attacked on the Owyhee River. 2 women were captured and questioned about Mrs. Donoil, who claimed she was taken to Chief Winnemucca at Steens Mountains, but could be ransomed for blankets and supplies. One was freed to arrange a meeting. On December 12th, another company found several wiki huts on the Owyhee River, which they attacked during a snowstorm. The Indians fled, but the army killed and captured 5 warriors and captured women and children. One of the women was wearing Mrs. Donoil's stockings, as well as other articles of her wardrobe. Throughout the Owyhees, articles of Mrs. Donoil's clothing kept being found worn by Paiute women in the following year. The Winnemucca followers hid and survived in the Steens Mountain area, fighting off and on until the end of the war in 1868. The Hunibuduka chief Panena was killed in central Oregon on April 25, 1867. In northern Nevada, small groups of Paiutes, tired of fighting and hiding, started to surrender at Camp McDermitt. And which leads us to our last variation of this map for the year 1868. At the beginning of the year 1868, natives in the Owyhee were starving. The war was entering its 4th year, and the concentration of troops made it more difficult to steal cattle. In the very first days of 1868, an Indian camp was found on the east side of the Owyhee River and attacked as the Paiutes fled toward a narrow defile where they took refuge in a cave. An Indian scout negotiated their surrender for several hours. They said they were tired of fighting and starving. But reports of stock being stolen kept reaching military posts. On March 26, a detachment was sent in pursuit of stolen stock towards the Steens Mountains and back toward the Owyhee River, nearby which they were found in a canyon. The fight with the Indians who were there concluded in a stalemate, and the detachment retreated. On May 26, a party made of cavalry, civilians, and Boise Indians went after a trail connected with an attack on a stagecoach. They traveled across the Owyhee and followed it towards Cedar Mountain, where they found 5 Wickiups. They waited until nighttime and attacked before dawn and devastated the camp, taking no prisoner. Just a few days later, on May 31st, 1868, during a scouting trip conducted by Lieutenant Alexander H. Stanton, Chief Egan and his followers were trapped in a canyon near Castle Rock in eastern Oregon, and the Wayadeaga headman was asked whether he wanted war or peace. He consulted with his followers for a day and accepted to surrender and to contact other bands that were tired of fighting. Egan contacted other prominent leaders, and in late June, the Wayadeaga chief Wiawiwa, the Kiritika chief Ochiho, and others came to Camp Harney with Egan to talk with Cook and ask for peace. It is possible that old Winnemucca was also there, because he later told a military officer that he received a promise from Crook, but no mention is made of his presence by anyone else. Captain Nickerson, a friend of Crook, reported the event, quote, "When spring came, the Indians sued for permission to surrender and make peace. Crook sent them word to come at Camp Harney, and in the latter part of the month of June 1868, we mounted our horses and rode across the country to that post. The day following our arrival, the Indians under old Wiawiwa, the principal chief in that region, were collected on the Camp Harney parade ground. They were squatted in a huge semicircle, and when Crook and his officers in full uniform approached from the open side of the parade, old Wiawiwa came towards the center from their side." Unquote. After refusing to shake Wiawiwa's hand and further playing his advantage for a while, Crook authorized the Paiutes to stay in the vicinity of Castle Rock if they stopped committing any attack or theft. And quote, "The terms of the agreement were very simple and easily understood. The Indians were to go back to their old hunting grounds, hunt, fish, dig roots, and trap, getting their living as they used to in the old time. If the white people came along or interfered with them in any way, they were to come to the military post, the commander of which would be authorized to protect them and to the fullest extent of his power. If at any time they were unable to secure food without stealing it from settlers, miners, or immigrants, then again they were to come to the post, the commander of which would be authorized to give them food, if he could spare it. But of this no positive promise was made. It was to be a privilege and not a right." End quote. The terms of peace settled, the fighting winding down. One last battle took place near the Owyhee River on July 26. The civilian had been attacked and wounded by Indians, and a detachment was sent after them from Camp Three Forks. They scouted for 2 days and found a band of 20 Indians in Juniper Canyon. They killed 5 and captured the rest, as well as 3 rifles, poisoned arrow, and a military uniform. Paiutes had been coming into Camp McDermitt since the previous year. One of the first ones to come in was Itzawiga, and some families who trusted to go with him with the promise of being clothed and fed by the military. Dennis Smart, who first welcomed me in McDermitt, shared in 2016 that when his ancestor Itzawiga, Coyote Rowe, was given a military uniform to wear instead of his native regalia at Camp McDermitt, he became Captain Horse. When the cavalry had chased him to lead him into camp, they said he ran like a horse. Thus, the native leader expressed on his own body the dramatic transformation that affected the Paiute people when they agreed to come into Camp McDermitt. It was the end of a lifestyle and the beginning of a new one, radically different and foreign, that they had to embrace and claim for themselves. In the summer of 1868, Sarah Winnemucca and Natchez were sent to bring in Chief Winnemucca, who was still hiding with 500 Paiutes in the Steens Mountain. At last, Winnemucca agreed to come in August. Sarah Winnemucca was hired as interpreter at Camp McDermitt. I'll stop sharing and conclude. The story of the Owyhee River and Canyon during the Snake War is a somber one, marked by more death than one can count. Gregory Michneau, who is one of the sources for my presentation, described it as, quote, the deadliest Indian war in the West, end quote. So much of the history of the area can be traced back to the Snake War, continues to affect memories and carries intergenerational trauma in our communities. But history has to be known, and there is also much to learn from it. I promised that I would use both military sources and Paiute oral traditions, and I wish I could have used more Paiute oral traditions, but there's simply not as much available about this distant period as there is in military papers. I provided what I could find or what people have been generous to share, but we have enough to draw comparison about how Euro-Americans and Paiutes told this shared history. One clear difference in the stories told by Lee Winnemucca, Pitsnap, or Tennesma in the military reports is the type of information they contain. Paiute oral traditions tend to center around an illustrative and compelling symbol, the cannon pulling mule falling down the mountain, or the howitzer offered by the Paiutes to the Owyhee River, or the new name and uniform of a leader shedding his ancient lifestyle. We could see here that exactitude and truth are secondary in all traditions and to the lessons to be learned. Lee Winnemucca and Pitsnap tell different stories about the cannon, neither quite agreeing with Major Marshall's report. Another major difference is the importance of humor in the telling of Paiute oral history. Situations are told in a way that makes them memorable and prone to be retold. In written history, events are fixed by the writer, while they are more likely to be read if their narrative is entertaining. This is seldom the objective, and certainly wasn't for military reports. Thusly, the purpose of written and oral historical documents are quite opposite. Written documents are there to provide evidence for further action, whereas oral documents are a collective endeavor to educate and entertain. Another element pervasive to Native accounts is that of communication. Lee Winnemucca described the cannon as an organ of communication, a response to the Indians calling at them from the other side of the canyon. Sarah Winnemucca later mentioned about the Bannock War that the Paiutes were only participating in a mock fight against the army. Already in the Snake War, there is evidence of the respect that the Paiutes vowed to the military. It may be said that the Paiutes had recently acquired firearms and were poor shots, as was reported by one Indian after one of the battles, allegedly. But let me offer this alternative explanation, that the Paiutes sometimes used firearms as a way of communicating, at a time when language remained inefficient. Turning a weapon into an instrument of communication, a shot into a message, is only a question of perspective. There are always two sides to a canyon, and enemies can reveal to be friends. In those historical narratives that we have explored today, remains one common thread, one line that unites and divides and always appears in the center. It is the Owyhee River, constantly the destination of Indians on the run, a place of life and escape. It served as a boundary. Often, the blood of the Paiutes returned to the flow of the river and sometimes merged with that of whites. Perhaps the Owyhee River was the last frontier, and perhaps it continues to be. And that's it, all I had to share today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. I'm sure I really enjoyed it. I think I can speak for everyone saying that we all really enjoyed it. So yeah, anyone have any questions or comments, feel free to come off mute, put them in the chat. I can ask them. Natasha York says, thank you, Thierry.
Thank you, Natasha.
Shane also says, thank you. Yes, folks, please take advantage and ask questions. Yes, Owyhee Falls. I'm not sure who that is. Please come off mute and ask your question.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is Bonnie Olin. I'm Owyhee Falls.
Hi,
Can
Bonnie.
you
Hi.
I'll keep it? Okay. The question I had, because I've not been on Google Meet before, I missed most of your presentation and then signed in incorrectly. So as it's been a lot of time fooling around. So is the meeting recorded, and will we be able to hear this again and see you again?
Yes, this has been recorded, so I will get this posted on our YouTube channel within the next few days, and I will send out an email to everyone with that link. So if you're signed up for the event, you'll get the link to the YouTube.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing it from beginning to end.
Yeah.
Yes, the question versus this in the Civil War. Please come off mute and ask your question. That'd be great.
At the start of the war in the Owyhee was also the start of the Civil War in the United States at the time. And so I'm assuming that the cavalry units that were fighting this were from the Oregonian area at the time, which was not part of the states. But I also thought that Oregon was also associated with the U.S. Civil War in some respects. So did these groups happen to work together, or were they totally separate? Or what?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's really very important, actually, when we think about the Snake War, because it is an important context at the beginning of the Snake War. The Snake War started in 1864, at a time when the Civil War was still running. And so that also explains why, in the first year, the Oregon Volunteers 5 men to the field, because there were so many Oregon volunteers that were sent east to fight in the Civil War. And it was at the time when in the West, state or territories would create their own local armies. And so we have the example of the California Volunteers, the Oregon Volunteers, and there was also the Nevada Volunteers. All of those armies, state armies, were relevant at that time. They were created during the Civil War as a way to raise troops to protect against, thank you, to protect against the South, and then also to support the northern armies, because the South was trying to make inways into the West and recruit people in the West too. So by creating those state armies, the North was able to contain the West from sending troops to the South. And so the Civil War ended in 1865, if I'm correct. And after that date, there was a big change in the way the military was organized in the United States. First of all of those state armies became U.S. Army. They were not, well, gradually. I mean, a lot of troops were moved from a state army status, a volunteer status, to a U.S. Army status. And then that also freed troops from East to come and fight in the Indian Wars. And so after 1865, you had a lot more U.S. troops in the Snake War. And that made a big difference. And that explained that someone like Lieutenant Colonel Crook, who became a general later on, came at that time in 1866, is because the Civil War has ended and you had officers and troops that were sent to the Indian Wars. So the Civil War is a very important context to understand the unfolding of the Snake War. Unfortunately for the Paiutes, the Civil War didn't last longer.
And the Chinese that were killed, were they mistaken to be just a type of Native American, or was that done purposely because they felt that they were incoming into the area and were going to be a problem, quote unquote, with what was going on?
That's also a good question, and it's hard to answer because it's not really it doesn't exist in the Paiute oral traditions. I mean, in the Paiute we'll talk about the Chinese being there, and but not having massacred them. And it's sometimes it's hard to know who did it. Although I don't doubt that some of these Chinese parties may have been killed by Paiutes. But when they did, there's of course never an excuse for massacre on either side. But the Chinese were coming to mine, and and the Paiutes knew that. The Chinese were perhaps the most visible expression of the extractive and exploitative industry that were coming to ravage their country. There's a lot, of debate up to this day about mining in Paiute country, and that's one explanation that I can think of, is that it was a way to fight the mining industry.
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have one more question. Fort McDermitt is now a casino, I'm assuming, or somewhere around there the casino is built. So are the Paiutes now, it's part of the reservation, or is it the Paiute tribe that's there, or is it another tribe that's there?
So the casino, there is a casino in McDermitt, but it's not on the reservation. It's actually owned by white people in town. So the Fort McDermitt Paiute-Shoshone Tribe doesn't have a lot of resources, actually, and they don't own a casino. There are other tribes that do, but not the Fort McDermitt Paiute-Shoshone.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Shane chiming in. I've got a question. So I guess I didn't realize how prolific the number of battles that occurred in this war were, and how geographically widespread across the Owyhee between the three states. In your research and so forth, did you visit many or all of these sites?
Not at all. I was just telling Tim that I feel like a fraud because, my knowledge of all these events is from my research, on the knowledge that elders have been generous to share with me. But, well, often elders are in no shape to go hike for 3 days. So I had never had the opportunity to go to any of these sites, to be honest. So I was telling Tim that it would be a nice addition to my knowledge of this history to be able to say that I've been there.
Thank you.
Well, Martika was asking how many of them are marked, of those sites. Tim, do you know if any of those sites are any form of indication?
There's no information at any of the sites. So I've went through the book that you've used a lot to reference the sites, and some are pretty detailed and you could pretty much pinpoint where it happened, and others it's a geographic region. So
yeah. Yes, I'll have to take a road trip with a 4-wheel drive rig. Some of it, Natasha, might involve hiking too.
I'll volunteer mine.
Sorry, Shane?
Oh, I was just saying I would definitely volunteer mine. I know there's probably several people even on this presentation that would love to go out there and it'd give you an opportunity to see these places and connect to these areas, and the rest of us would enjoy hearing what you had to say about it.
Mm-hmm. And I could also ask elders if they would like to go on a trip like that. That might be something they want to do.
we as well would be interested in seeing some of the sites.
Sounds like it might be a good Friends of the Owyhee trip for the future. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Yeah, that's right. I was thinking that being able to, after hearing your presentation, and then to go and actually see these sites, I think would really help to put into context what people were up against in terms of the geography, the topography, the difficulties of moving from point A to point B. The canyons are so formidable, and yet I am imagining that many of these places are near the different crossings, various drainages that dip down into the river, etc. But even some of those can exact a lot of physical effort from an individual. So that is really a great idea for future Friends of the Owyhee, or, the elders would be so generous to take individuals to these sites, because that's not something they're always open to. These are sacred places for the indigenous communities, and so I would be surprised but hopeful that they might share this knowledge. I'll turn off my mic. It was just a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'll ask people what they think about
it. How many elders did you communicate with? This is Shane again. In your research, and were they pretty forthright or open to talking with you?
Well, it's could be a long answer, but I would say about a dozen elders worked with me on both historical tape translation and also general language work. I've corresponded or talked with many more, but I think, when I first came to McDermitt, I had someone who had invited me. That Dennis Mart that I mentioned, and he was very helpful in putting me on the right track for the mission that I had. And what he did is he told me that he wouldn't tell me anything himself, and I would have to go and see all the other elders. So he was my gatekeeper into the community, and then I had to reach out to as many people as I could, and some of them told me no, that they would not work with me, and others did. And so every time I came back, more people were willing to work with me. So it's just a story of time and dedication and improving yourself.
This is Bonnie again. I have another question. Were you also reaching out to the people at the Duck Valley Indian Reservation, or is it just McDermitt?
So I've never been to Owyhee either, which sounds odd for the specialist or the presenter to have no intimate knowledge of those places. But I have friends, from the Owyhee, the Duck Valley community. Like I mentioned earlier on my bio, I worked for the Burns Paiute Tribe for over a year, and so I worked with elders there in that capacity, and even before that. Before I was hired as language and traditional culture manager for the Burns Paiute Tribe, I worked with elders already. So my work is primarily with people in McDermitt, but I also have worked a lot with people in Burns. I have elders that I correspond or work with in nearly, every Paiute community, at least north of Reno, but I've never worked in Owyhee in Duck Valley.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for this comment. It's always invaluable to get community feedback. And
all right. Well, if there are no other questions, we are at time for the webinar. So just want to thank you all again for coming, and thank you, Thierry, so much for presenting. This was super interesting, really exciting to have this kind of information shared with us here at Friends of the Owyhee. So we really appreciate your time.
yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah.